It was meant to be just another congressional hearing. The cameras were rolling, the committee room was packed with lawmakers, tech executives, and civil rights leaders. And the air felt sharp with political tension. This wasn't just about policy. This was about power, who controlled the next generation of artificial intelligence, and who would be held accountable when it failed. At the center of it all sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. Her tone calm but piercing, her questions direct and loaded with intent. She had been grilling a panel of AI developers about algorithmic bias. Why facial recognition software flagged black men as threats more often than white men. Why predictive policing apps disproportionately targeted poor neighborhoods, and why oversight always seemed like an afterthought. The room listened, some leaning forward, others squirming. Jasmine's voice cut through the static of rehearsed answers. She had the data. She had the questions. She had control. That's when it happened. A soft tap echoed from the other end of the table. Barron Trump, seated in a crisp suit with the same cold composure the world had watched grow over the past few years, reached forward and adjusted his microphone. The chair recognized him, surprised. He wasn't expected to speak. Barron had been sitting still, silent, listening. But now, all eyes turned, with all due respect to Congresswoman Crockett. Barron began, "I believe she's unfit to lead this conversation." The room froze, some gasped, others stared, waiting to see if he was joking. He wasn't. "She's made previous statements that discredit the legitimacy of this committee," continued, "and I think that undermines the integrity of our mission." He leaned back in his chair like a man who thought he'd just played a perfect move. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice or break her gaze. She simply leaned toward her mic with a small, unreadable smile. "Mr. Trump," she said, "since you've questioned my fitness, let me offer something for the record." She reached under her desk, unlocked her tablet, and tapped play. The room filled with the sound of a recording, clear, sharp, undeniable. Barron's voice echoed through the speakers. It was a private fundraiser held just 2 weeks earlier. You could hear the laughter, the clinking of glasses. And then Barron Agononly, this time not calm or composed. He was laughing, joking with donors about how AI systems with racial bias were useful for identifying trouble faster, and how most of this regulation stuff is just theater for headlines. The room snapped. Gasps turned into murmurs. Journalists in the back began typing furiously. Aide staff scrambled to confirm the clip's authenticity. One lawmaker covered his mouth in disbelief. The chair pounded the gavel, demanding order, but it was useless. The damage had already been done. Jasmine paused the clip and looked directly at Barron. "Is that leadership to you?" she asked, her voice even. "Or is that the performance of someone unfit to speak on equity at all?" He didn't answer, his expression cracked just slightly, eyes blinking, jaw tight. The silence around him was louder than anything he'd said outside the chamber. Within minutes, the clip hit social media like lightning. Hashtags exploded. Hashtag Crockett strikes back. Hashtag Barron unmasked. Hashtag AI hypocrisy. News anchors dropped prepared scripts. Breaking news alerts lit up every major screen. Inside the hearing room, the chaos settled into a thick, uneasy quiet. No one knew what would come next, but they knew something had just changed. The boy who once stood in his father's shadow had finally stepped into the spotlight, and Jasmine Crockett had burned it down in less than a minute. The moment the hearing ended, the Capitol building seemed to pulse with tension. Reporters swarmed the exits. Phones rang nonstop inside congressional offices. Staffers moved like fire crews after an explosion, trying to assess the damage, rewrite the narrative, contain the shock. But it was already too late. The clip of Barron Trump's private fundraiser comments was everywhere. By the time Jasmine Crockett stepped into the hallway, the video had been viewed over 12 million times on multiple platforms. Some were calling it one of the most important political exposures since the Cambridge Analytica leaks. Others called it a cheap ambush. But the footage didn't lie. Barron's voice, casual and mocking, betraying the very policies he claimed to support during the hearing, it struck a nerve far deeper than just political hypocrisy. It spoke to something larger, something darker. A truth to many already suspected that powerful men talked about justice in public and joked about power in private. Jasmine didn't stop to answer questions. She walked calmly past the press, her team shielding her from flashing lights and endless microphones. She didn't need to explain anything. Her statement had already been made. Meanwhile, inside a quiet corner office on Capitol Hill, Barron Trump sat with his chief of staff and legal advisor, staring at a paused frame of his own face on a screen, his expression frozen in mid-laugh. The audio continued to haunt the room, looping faintly from the next room where a CNN analyst was tearing apart his credibility live. "This is bad," his chief of staff whispered. "You weren't supposed to talk today. That wasn't the plan." Barron didn't respond. His fingers tapped against the table. Calculating always had been, but now even he could feel the trap. He thought he had controlled the narrative. He thought Jasmine was unprepared. Instead, she had waited, watched, and dropped the hammer with perfect timing. Outside, the media war had begun. Right-wing commentators rushed to his defense. One Fox News anchor called it an orchestrated political hit job and suggested the audio was edited or illegally obtained. Others argued the comments were taken out of context, part of a private satire not meant to be serious, but their voices were buried beneath. The tidal wave of reaction from independent media, civil rights advocates, and younger voters. TikTok was flooded with stitched videos breaking down every second of the recording. Activists posted Jasmine's question, "Is that leadership to you?" over footage of past political scandals. A meme began to circulate of Barron's face mid-reaction, edited with the words, "unfit." Play the tape. That night, Jasmine appeared on a national morning show. The set was simple, the tone respectful. She sat across from the anchor with her hands folded, no bravado, just presence. "What do you say to those who claim you ambushed him?" the anchor asked. Jasmine nodded slightly. "If I ambushed him, he should have said nothing worth hiding." The anchor paused. "You think it's fair to release a private recording?" Jasmine leaned forward. "What's dangerous isn't that he said it, it's that he said it behind closed doors and then tried to lecture me in public. That's the very definition of unfit. You can't fake your values." By noon, that clip had crossed 30 million views. Within hours, a fresh wave of opinion columns flooded digital newsrooms. Some questioned her tactics. Others praised her foresight. But one thing was certain: Jasmine Crockett had seized the national conversation, not by force, but by proof. As Barron's team drafted a response, the internal tone shifted from defense to desperation. He released a short statement claiming the comments were taken out of context and meant to be satirical. But it did little to stop the bleeding. In fact, it made things worse. The statement implied the words were real, just misunderstood. The internet doesn't forgive that kind of admission. Late-night hosts mocked the excuse. Political comedians looped the quote about surveillance bias with laugh tracks and sound effects. But activists weren't laughing. They used the moment to spotlight real victims of AI misidentification, 8 teenagers falsely accused by algorithms, families targeted by flawed data systems. Jasmine's campaign staff began receiving thousands of messages, some support, some threats, and many sharing personal stories of injustice. The story wasn't just about Barron anymore. It was about trust, about who speaks for fairness and who profits from pretending to. And somewhere, in a media war room with 10 screens and blinking notifications, strategists leaned over a digital map of polling trends and said aloud what many had just begun to fear: He was supposed to be the next Trump. But now he's just the guy who got caught. Inside newsrooms across the country, editors were redlining morning coverage in real time. Television producers pulled soft segments and replaced them with panels dissecting every frame of Jasmine Crockett's takedown. The political landscape was shifting not over a policy debate, but because of a sound-clipped 12 seconds that exposed a hidden face of power. It was no longer a scandal. It was a reckoning. By mid-morning, a second wave of media heat rolled in. Independent journalists had begun analyzing the location of the fundraiser Barron was recorded at. The details weren't supposed to be public. But a staffer's anonymous leak confirmed what many suspected. The event wasn't just for domestic donors. Several executives from foreign tech companies were present, companies with direct ties to AI contracts under federal review. Some of them were already under investigation by European regulators for discriminatory arbitrary algorithms. Changed everything. Suddenly, what looked like a political blunder now smelled like corruption. Editorials sharpened. What was Barron doing at a closed-door event with international lobbyists? Why did the recording contain laughter about keeping surveillance sharp and calming the public with cosmetic reforms? Was he aligning with companies seeking to quietly kill regulation while pretending to support equity? In response, the White House press secretary was forced to issue a statement. It was careful, neutral, but loaded. The administration remains committed to transparency and equity in all technology policy. We encourage all public figures, regardless of party, to lead with honesty and consistency. No names were mentioned. But the message was clear. On Capitol Hill, tension rose like heat in a sealed room. Some Republican lawmakers defended Barron, accusing Jasmine of violating procedural norms. Others, more cautious, began to distance themselves. A few quietly reached out to Jasmine's office, not to challenge her, but to listen. In private, they admitted it was rare to see someone walk into a hearing with that level of proof and restraint. She hadn't attacked him. She had let the evidence speak. Inside a campaign-style bunker in Virginia, Barron Trump's media advisors were working without breaks. The plan had been to craft his first major national moment, a clean, sharp introduction to a younger generation. But now the narrative had exploded. His prepared remarks about bridging partisan gaps in AI ethics were now memes. It's polished. Image as a thoughtful conservative was melting in the face of raw, leaked audio. His team debated strategy. Some wanted to go nuclear, call the recording illegal, accuse Jasmine of political entrapment, claim foreign tampering. Others urged silence, hoping the story would burn out. But then came the blow they hadn't prepared for. Jasmine went live again. She stood alone on the Capitol steps. No podium, no stage lights. It's just a mic and questions. "I want to be clear," she said. "This isn't about one man's comment. It's about the way power protects itself in back rooms and then lectures us about responsibility on camera." A journalist asked if she planned the moment. "I plan to protect the truth," she replied. "And sometimes that means being ready when someone lies to your face." A hush fell across the group. Then she pulled out a folder. "There's more," she said. Within minutes, a second audio clip appeared online. This one shorter, just Barron saying, "The public doesn't need fairness. They need to feel like fairness exists." The comment was followed by a room full of laughter. That was the turning point. Media outlets dropped neutrality. National Public Radio ran the headline. Barron Trump manufactured integrity and the crisis of political performance. The New York Times front page read, "The Quiet Weapon: How Jasmine Crockett Changed the Hearing and the Conversation." Across college campuses, student-led discussions formed around AI ethics and political accountability. On Instagram, influencers, who rarely touched politics, posted clips from Jasmine's speech. Even overseas, European lawmakers commented on the story, using it as an example of why tech governance needed to remain public. Not corporate. Back in his campaign office, Barron sat alone. Aides left him too quiet. He stared at the floor, arms crossed, jaw locked. He had wanted a fight. He expected pushback. But not this. Not the feeling that he'd been seen, not just exposed. His performance didn't fall apart because he lied. It fell apart because someone had receipts. And Jasmine Crockett hadn't needed to raise her voice. She had only pressed play in the dim-lit war rooms of political consultancy firms across Washington. The tone had changed. What had been a planned rollout of Barron Trump's polished political debut had devolved into what one strategist called the most public self-immolation in recent memory. Every media cycle brought a fresh layer of scrutiny, and now it wasn't just about what Barron had said, it was about who had heard it and who had paid to sit in that room by the end of the week. A joint report from 2 independent watchdogs confirmed that several of the donors present at the fundraiser were linked to lobbying groups, pushing anti-regulation agendas for AI surveillance. One name stood out: Texas, a powerful firm whose facial recognition software had been banned in parts of the EU for racial profiling. The company had long denied wrongdoing, but the timing was explosive. They were one of the companies Barron had mocked regulation about while sipping champagne and joking about optics. Suddenly, it wasn't just political hypocrisy, was possible collusion. International outlets picked up the story. BBC, Al Jazeera, Der Spiegel headlined their coverage with the same image: Barron Trump's face, frozen mid-smile, captured from the leaked audio's video still. France's Ministry of Digital Affairs publicly demanded an explanation from American authorities regarding Barron's ties to our Texas. Brussels requested a formal inquiry into whether U.S. lawmakers were being influenced by foreign AI firms known to sidestep European human rights protocols. And still, Jasmine Crockett said nothing. She didn't tweet. She didn't post videos. She didn't appear on the usual evening panels. Her silence became its own kind of statement, one that left every pundit talking without her even needing to speak. That silence, though, was not passive. Inside her office, her staff was working around the clock. They weren't celebrating, they were organizing. Drafts of the AI Equity and Accountability Act were being revised. Provisions on transparency, bias audits, and public disclosures were being strengthened. Jasmine knew that moments like this, when truth struck through the noise, didn't last long. And if nothing changed, then everything she had exposed would simply become another news cycle. Casualty. Meanwhile, Barron's team shifted into aggressive counter-narratives. Anonymous sources began whispering to the press that the recording was illegally obtained, that it had been doctored for effect, even suggesting it may have been captured by someone planted in his inner circle. One of his spokespeople floated the theory that Jasmine's staff coordinated the leak in violation of federal ethics. It was a desperate attempt to reframe the conversation, but people weren't buying it. The public, already inundated with years of doublespeak and performative outrage, seemed to recognize something genuine in Jasmine's delivery: her quiet confidence, her refusal to grandstand. She hadn't screamed, she hadn't gloated, she had simply revealed. And that, in today's political climate, was rare enough to feel revolutionary. Still, not everyone applauded. Some political veterans, even from her own party, privately expressed discomfort. One senator from the Midwest whispered to reporters, "Off the record, she might be right, but she's made powerful enemies. This is going to get uglier." And it did. Within 24 hours of the fundraiser report going viral, Jasmine's office received a wave of cyber attacks. Emails were leaked. Internal communications from her early campaigns were released out of context. Right-wing outlets published pieces accusing her of being radical, angry, divisive. A well-known commentator called her the most dangerous voice in Congress. A super PAC ran a digital ad saying Jasmine Crockett doesn't want oversight, she wants revenge. The smear campaign was brutal, fast, and calculated. But it only added fuel, because for every attack, there was a counter-message. Activists began posting side-by-side videos. Barron's fundraiser comments versus Jasmine's hearing moment. Universities hosted live streams debating surveillance ethics. Civil rights groups launched an online petition demanding the passage of her AI equity bill, collecting over 300,000 signatures in under 48 hours. Then, late one evening, Jasmine reappeared. No speech, no media invite. It's just a short video uploaded. To her official page, she stood at a podium in a quiet room, looking straight into the camera. "I didn't come to Congress to argue," she said. "I came to protect people who never get a seat at the table. And if pressing play on the truth is what it takes to be called divisive, then so be it. I'll keep pressing." The clip went viral within minutes. Not because of the production, not because of the message, but because everyone watching could feel it. She wasn't defending herself. She was daring them to try and stop her. The meeting with the president took place behind closed doors in the Roosevelt Room. No cameras. No press pool. Just two aides on standby and a folder that Jasmine Crockett placed gently on the table. She didn't bring notes. She didn't need them. Every statistic, every clause in the Public Integrity and Technology Act, every connection between Barron Trump's fundraiser and foreign surveillance firms, she carried them in her head like armor. President Harris sat across from her, sleeves rolled up, eyes sharp with curiosity. "You've shifted something," the president said after reviewing the final amendment list. "That doesn't happen often anymore, not without a price." Jasmine didn't flinch. "I didn't come here to build comfort. I came here to protect the people most often erased by policy. And I'm not asking for favors. I'm asking for support." The president gave a single nod. "You have it." That night, word of the private meeting leaked. It wasn't a grand announcement, no official photographs. But it sent a signal across Washington. The administration was aligning with Jasmine Crockett's legislation. And just like that, opposition from moderate fence-sitters began to crumble. Even those who'd remained neutral, afraid to choose between the Trump legacy and the shifting political wind, realized the floor beneath them was moving. Barron, meanwhile, disappeared from public view. His campaign website went offline. Scheduled university speech was canceled without explanation. Rumors swirled. He was regrouping, negotiating with donors, blaming staff, but none of it mattered. His story had already been written, not as the next political heir, but as the man who thought he controlled the room until the microphone turned back on him. In the days that followed, Jasmine's bill passed through committee with a surprising 13-2 vote. The two dissenting members didn't give press statements. They didn't want to be the faces arguing against AI transparency while the nation watched. And the nation was still watching. In schools across the country, civics teachers played clips of Jasmine's hearing. In New York and Chicago, murals began to appear, spray-painted quotes like "You only press play when the lie demands it, and prepared is power." Activists began calling it the Crockett standard, a phrase that meant holding receipts, holding composure, and holding the powerful to their own words. At a tech conference in San Francisco, Jasmine gave a keynote to a packed auditorium of engineers, civil rights lawyers, and digital ethicists. She didn't talk about politics. She talked about voice. "When we regulate technology," she said, "we're not just shaping machines. We're shaping how humanity is measured, tracked, judged, and remembered. If the rules are written in silence, people get erased." The crowd rose to their feet. Across the world, governments took notice. Australia proposed new oversight policies inspired by Jasmine's legislation. Kenya's parliament referenced her bill during their own debates on biometric scanning. In South Korea, a primetime debate aired with the title, "Can the U.S. Learn from Jasmine Crockett?" But perhaps the most unexpected moment came during a quiet afternoon on the Hill, as Jasmine walked through a hallway lined with portraits of past lawmakers. She was approached by a young intern. Nervous, fidgeting, she said, "I just wanted to thank you, not for the bill, for not backing down, for not yelling, for just proving them wrong without even needing to say you were right. Jasmine smiled, nodded, and kept walking because she knew the work wasn't over. The next week, she was scheduled to testify before a joint global commission on ethics and surveillance. And beyond that, hearings on drone oversight, digital redlining, and AI in education. But this time, when she stepped into the chamber, no one questioned her fitness. They questioned their own preparedness. The Crockett Doctrine had begun, not as a moment, not as a takedown, but as a reset. Because in a world that often rewarded performance over purpose, Jasmine Crockett had reminded everyone watching that the mic doesn't make you powerful. It only amplifies what's already true. Somewhere behind a thick glass wall on K Street, a senior lobbyist stared at a paused clip of Jasmine Crockett's face. The video was frozen mid-sentence, but her eyes were focused, unblinking, like she knew what was coming before anyone else. Around him, aides murmured into headsets and flipped through thick briefing folders. Our Texas was in full crisis mode. The leaks had connected to many dots. Barron Trump's private comments weren't just a gaffe anymore, they were evidence. Evidence that the son of a former president, on the verge of launching his own political identity, had been sitting in rooms filled with executives from foreign surveillance firms while publicly claiming to care about equity. And now, international watchdogs were circling in Brussels. The European Commission held an emergency session on data ethics. Several members mentioned the Crockett-Trump hearing by name. One delegate from Sweden called it the clearest example yet of why unregulated U.S. tech influence poses a cross-border threat. A German digital rights agency filed a formal complaint with the U.S. Embassy in Berlin. In London, a former MI6 analyst warned on live television that when data policy becomes a currency traded in private fundraisers, democracy stops being a process and becomes a product. Back in D.C., pressure mounted. Reporters swarmed Capitol Hill, pressing lawmakers for statements. Some tried to dodge the fire by playing both sides, claiming to support transparency while defending Barron's right to private speech. But that position didn't hold. Too many knew what the fundraiser was. Too many knew what was said. And Jasmine Crockett, she still wasn't gloating. Instead, she went to work. In a closed-door strategy meeting, her legal team reviewed every known detail about the leak, who recorded it, how it was vetted, whether she had broken any procedural boundaries. The answer was clear. She hadn't. The recording had been sent to her anonymously, verified by a third-party investigator, and then authenticated through her legal staff. It wasn't a political stunt. It was documentation. Still, she knew what was coming. That night, Barron Trump's campaign filed a formal complaint with the House Ethics Committee. They accused Jasmine of breaching trust, weaponizing private speech, and undermining the decorum of congressional procedure. The document was long, full of legal padding and rhetorical swipes. But its goal was simple: to shift the conversation. But the public wasn't shifting. Polls showed an unexpected dip in Barron's favorability among younger Republicans. Independent voters, especially tech workers, civil libertarians, and college-educated suburban women, turned sharply against him. One independent pollster described it bluntly. They saw the clip, they saw the reaction, and they made their judgment in real time. Inside Barron's own camp, the cracks deepened. One senior aide anonymously told a reporter he underestimated her, thought she was just another name at the table. But she came armed with the truth, and that hit harder than any opposition strategy we prepped for. Late-night news ran special coverage. MSNBC titled their segment "Power and Exposure." When the microphone turns on the speaker, CNN brought in AI experts to discuss the ethical implications. Even conservative publications like the National Review acknowledged whether or not one agrees with her politics. Crockett has emerged as the face of legislative preparedness. Then came the next twist. During an emergency session on digital ethics oversight, Jasmine introduced a new amendment, the Public Integrity in Technology Act. a clause mandating full disclosure of foreign affiliations for any company lobbying on AI. Policy within U.S. borders. The room fell still. This wasn't just a speech. This was a trap reset in reverse. Lawmakers, who had stayed silent during the fallout, now had to choose: either stayed with the amendment or publicly align with the very firms under scrutiny. One by one, co-sponsors signed on. Back in his office, Barron watched the coverage in silence. His team asked if he wanted to make another statement. Maybe go on air. Maybe clarify. But he knew what they didn't want to say. Every word he spoke now only reminded people of the ones he couldn't take back. And Jasmine Crockett. She wasn't just controlling the room anymore. She was redrawing the entire battlefield. As dawn broke over Washington, the Capitol dome glowed beneath a quiet sky, but inside the city, tension buzzed like an electrical wire ready to snap. Jasmine Crockett's proposed legislation, the Public Integrity and Technology Act, was moving faster than anyone had expected. Within 48 hours, it had gained bipartisan momentum. What began as a clapback to a disrespectful insult had now become the most significant piece of AI-related policy debated in the last decade. Journalists no longer asked if Jasmine was retaliating. They were asking what room she'd walk into next. But Barron Trump wasn't finished. At a private press briefing held in a luxury hotel ballroom, he appeared for the first time since the leaked recording broke. Dressed sharply, calm, collected, he approached the podium surrounded by American flags and stone-faced advisors. The room was packed with reporters. His team had handpicked the most sympathetic ones, hoping to reset the narrative. "Let me begin by saying I believe in transparency," he said. "I believe in the future of ethical AI, and I believe what we need now is unifying division." Then came the pivot. What Congresswoman Crockett did last week was political theater. It wasn't leadership. It was sabotage. A few gasps. A few pens scribbled faster. He continued, framing himself as the victim of a coordinated smear. The clip that was play taken without consent, stripped of context, and weaponized during a formal hearing sets a dangerous precedent for American discourse. His words were deliberate, controlled, but not sincere. And Jasmine knew it. She watched the press conference from her office in silence. Her staff expected her to respond immediately. Social media was already exploding with hashtags like #Barron deflects and #Jasmine speaks for us. But she told them, wait. Let him finish, because she had more later that night as major networks aired Barron's statement. Jasmine released a short video. It wasn't glossy or overproduced. Just her, sitting across from a journalist in a simple room. "Let's talk about context," she said. "Because that's what they're asking for, right?" She nodded to the screen as the original fundraiser clip replayed. Then came the second, one Barron speaking dismissively about surveillance equity. Then a third, previously unreleased, Barron advising a small group of lobbyists to avoid mentioning racial data when drafting tech legislation. Just say community safety. It tests better. The reporter looked stunned. "You had this the whole time?" "I had it, though. Moment he called me unfit," she replied, "and I waited. Not out of strategy, out of principle. Because you only press play when the lie demands it." The segment shattered records. Within 6 hours, it had been viewed over 40 million times. Even anchors who had been skeptical earlier now leaned in her direction. A panel on CNN called it one of the most devastating policy exposures in modern politics. International reactions poured in. Canada's Minister of Digital Affairs praised Jasmine's poise and clarity. A delegation of African and European lawmakers sent a joint letter to Congress supporting the new legislation. In Tokyo, an AI ethics conference added a last-minute panel titled Truth, Exposure, and the Crockett Doctrine. The Trump orbit remained quiet for 24 hours. Then, in a stunning move, Barron's campaign treasurer resigned. Her resignation letter leaked to the press. cited ethical discomfort and irreconcilable differences regarding public honesty. She didn't mention the tapes. She didn't need to. And Jasmine. She addressed the House again, this time not to challenge Barron but to thank her colleagues for every time someone called me too emotional, too reactive, too much I brought facts, I brought truth. And truth doesn't always show up polished. Sometimes it shows up angry. Sometimes it shows up tired. But it always shows up prepared. The chamber gave her a standing ovation that night. Her office received a phone call from the White House. It wasn't about the scandal. It was about her bill. The president wanted to meet, privately. And in that moment, as she closed her folder and stepped toward the corridor, Jasmine Crockett understood something crystal clear. She had not just survived the fire, she had made them walk through it with her.